person is, the shorter the bio is in here. Michael, as you can see, is a professor emeritus from Boise, the Ontario Institute of Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. And it says here he's a prolific author. So I decided to go to online and go to Google Scholar. And when you go in Google Scholar and you put in the name Michael Fullan, it goes on and on and on and on and on and on with all of his publications. But what I really like about Google Scholar is, for example, his book, The New Meaning of Educational Change. It tells you how many people cited the book. Now, by the cited, of course, that is how many people have written an article or written a book or a chapter, whatever, and this particular book is cited. So it's only 4,676 citations on that book. That's all. When I look in, people like myself, I might see 30 or 40 people citing my book. There's a big difference. Michael and I had breakfast, and he was talking about his work all around the world. And when you look at the books he's written, and I just quickly grabbed a few of them, but What's Worth Fighting For, the trilogy, Change Forces trilogy, Leading in a Culture of Change, which he received the Book of the Year award from the National Staff Development Council in 2002. The Moral Imperative of School Leadership, Leadership and Sustainability, Breakthrough, Learning Places, Turnaround Leadership, What's Worth Fighting For in the Principalship, and then I believe his most recent work is the one that you have, The 6 Secrets of Change. So, Dr. Fullan, thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. We have, I guess, an hour and 3/4, so let me set the stage, and there'll be plenty of time for interaction and talking about these ideas. I first want to say that everything I'm going to talk about refers to things that we're doing. So this isn't about research or theory anymore in that same sense. In fact, the 6 secrets, which is, I'll use as a frame for this, came from practice more than it came from theory. That is, we didn't write the 6 secrets and then implement them. We implemented things in partnerships with schools and districts and whole systems, and then extracted what we were learning and represented it as the 6 secrets, testing it against the business literature, the best of the business literature, as well as the educational literature. So in a very real sense, this continues to be grounded. I would say simultaneously we're working on the big picture and the small picture. That is what happens within the classroom or at the closest level of learning, as well as how do we get whole systems engaged. You see my logo there. It's very user-friendly. You can get on the website and pull down recent PDFs that we've done. So there's lots of easy access that way. CA is for Canada, not California, but it is there, and do use it. There's also an email that you can contact me. On the 6 secrets, you could say, and you could say, well, they're not secrets anymore because you wrote a book about them, and now you have the book. But the fact is, I consider them still to be secrets because they're nuanced. And what I hope I'll be able to do with you is pull out some of the main nuances. And we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about the book, in a sense, after doing a slew of workshops. We do a lot of workshops around the world in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, across, of course, North America. And when you spend day after day doing a workshop, 9 till, say, 3:30 with people like yourselves, poring over this stuff, you really get a lot of, you test it, but you also get much more closer to the level of operational meaning. So I'm just going to show you the 6 secrets, but not really dwell on them except by getting inside them. These are the 6. The words won't mean very much, and they won't be deep enough. They interact with each other. That is to say, if you are missing one of them, you're missing more than 1/6, because they pull out they pull out the best in each other, so to speak. So you lose diminishing returns every one of them that's missing. I used to do it when I first did the workshops, I did it in a linear fashion, starting with love your employees. But since we all know that not all employees are lovable, it got us into kind of the wrong track to start with. So I now start with what I call the core. That is the middle 4, the 2 to 5. And in many ways, they're the instructional core. They are the part that we can really kind of establish as in this fashion. I will, in the course of this, I'll use video clips and a number of other illustrations. And at the end, I'll also tell you about the strategy in full-blown action, I guess I'll call it, and I'll forecast a little bit in a moment. We started, I'm going to say, this serious work, which I call whole system reform. Whole system, at a minimum, is all schools in a given district, but I prefer all schools, let's say, in the state or the province. So that whole system reform, I'm going to say, as a deliberate theory of action. By theory of action, I mean a practical theory. I would say started in 1997, so it's only 12 years old. And it started in England. Tony Blair, when he was first elected, his chief architect, strategist is Michael Barber, who actually works a lot with us and in this country quite a bit these days. And Michael Barber and Tony Blair established a focus on literacy and numeracy. Tony Blair said, we're going to use the change knowledge to inform our strategies and to set up this focus, and we're going to deliberately put it into action. They commissioned us in Toronto to evaluate it, so a team of 4 or 5 of us went over to England for quite a lot for 4 years, 98 to 2002. They focused on literacy and numeracy I'll say the good news and the problematic news was this. The good news was we now could say that if you use this knowledge, you can bring about measurable positive reform on a very large scale within one election period. That's the best way to put it, less than 4 years. And so they went up measuring literacy and numeracy, the 11-year-olds, went up from about 62% high proficiency to 75%. So it was pretty impressive because we're talking about 20,000 schools, 160 local authorities, districts, larger than many districts, but nonetheless, that's a big system to change that seriously within that short time. Around year 3 of our evaluation, we began to sound some warning bells, which was, this is impressive, never has it been done on such a scale, but it also is problematic because it's not getting deep enough into the hearts and minds of teachers and principals. It's too top-down. It was top-down. It was quite well done as a top-down reform. That is, lots of support for what we call capacity building. But it was too top-down, and we said it has a relatively short shelf life from here on in as a strategy. So, in fact, it did run out of gas. It plateaued, and for the next 3 or 4 years, they stayed plateaued and didn't get really beyond that very well. So the lesson from this was that you do need to focus, you need to invest in capacity building, but beware of too much top-downness, something I'll get to later. And then in 2002, the leader of the opposition party in Ontario, Dalton McGuinty, we were heading to election 2003 in Ontario. Ontario is, in Canada, there's no federal agency in education, so each province is 100% autonomous as far as education policy. And McGuinty got elected on an education platform that we worked out that said, in Ontario had about 5 years of stagnation. They were a good system, but not a very good system. And prior to 2003, 5 years of stagnation. So it wasn't as big as England, but still sizable, 5,000 schools. 2 million students, 130,000 teachers, and 72 districts. And the question was, can you bring about reform within one election period, if I use that shorthand top? And we have done that. And towards the end of this, when I get to Systems Learn, I'm going to talk about the Ontario case a little more explicitly, just to show you what the strategy looks like in actual action. It's not that we have invented the ideas in Ontario. It's more that we've had the opportunity to put them into place with complete political leadership at the center and really put them into place, drawing on the best we knew from England, from this country, and from around the world. So let's take a look at, here's kind of the flow of the agenda that I alluded to. I want to start in a couple of minutes with insights into the change process, just a few things to get started about how we think about change itself. And then, as I said, we'll go into the instructional core, the quartet, secrets 2 to 5, and then pull out leadership and what I call the wraparound, which is the systems learn and the love your employees. I'm not sure that of the order when we get to that, but that's the rough and ready flow. So let me start then with this notion of a few ideas about change. Change itself, there's a few things, and I'm going to suggest something that you'll find intuitively accurate, but it's not, I'll say, the way that we often think about change in terms of vision and implementation and support, but it's more real to how change actually happens, how people change. And I want to start with a rather simple notion. A lot of us are focusing these days, and a good thing, on instruction. And so the question is, what is the nature of the change that might go on from the point of view of a student and a teacher? And usually it's about the tip of the implementation iceberg, I call it, the new materials, these days technology. So it's the part you can see, you can pick up, it is tangible. Below the surface are the people, let's say, and the behaviors, practices, skills, and competencies is the second one, and the beliefs and understandings are a third. So I'm going to say the problem of change, let's put it this way, is that it's a process of redoing and rethinking. And that's the best way to start about it before you start with any group. You are entering a process of a proposition of redoing and rethinking. And once you put it that way, you know that it's very difficult. It's hard for one person to redo and rethink what they've been doing, even if they're motivated and want to do it. It's multiply hard for lots of people to do it when quite a few don't. And here's another way of describing the problem of change. How do you get change on a large scale when a lot of people don't want to do it? That's really the problem. How do you get change on a large scale when a lot of people actually don't want to do it at the outset? What's going to make it connect for them? And that's what these are about. And there's about half a dozen insights that they all form a same cluster, and I'll pull out the meaning of the cluster after we've seen them. I want to give you two versions of this, the implementation dip. This is something we've had for a while. It is, I'm going to say, the universal finding that when you introduce a change, even if you've had pre-implementation preparation here, that the first months are going to be bumpy. And this by definition. How could it not be bumpy if you have a bunch of people who are ambivalent about change, some of them at least, and even if they're not ambivalent, they're not necessarily good at it because it's the skills, the competencies, the insights, the understanding. So it can't be smooth. It's going to be bumpy. And that's important to know. Once we brought it out into the open, two good things happened, I'm going to say. One is that a lot of people immediately felt better if they knew this was normal. And secondly, and more helpfully, it meant that you directly have to focus on supporting implementation during this early period. I'm going to say it a couple of different ways, that implementation is more important than any other thing in that equation. Put it another way, communication, of which we'll see as key, is far more important during implementation than it is prior to implementation. Prior to implementation, it doesn't mean very much. During implementation, it means a lot because people are doing it. So you can see where there's a bias for action in these. I want to show you a second one, though, that came out last year, the same phenomenon from a business book called Changing the Way We Manage Change by Harold and Feder. And they have the same identical concept, but they give us more insights in this way of putting it. Remember, they're finding this in their studies of business. They say three things here that are key for me. One is when change is introduced here, the people introducing the change have this assumption that things will get better. Sure, it might level off eventually, but things are going to get better right away because it's such a good idea. They call that the myth of change, and I've just told you that it is a myth because it can't happen. It's impossible. Now, the other two insights are inside this triangle. And I want you to think inside this triangle right now, what they call the depth of decline in this first period. And in the triangle, let's think of it from 2 points of view. One, the implementer, and the other, those leading implementation. There might be overlap in who they are, but nonetheless, that's a good way of thinking about it. If you're an implementer and you're at this stage, the costs to you are immediate, concrete, and palpable because you're not good at it. The gains to you are theoretical and distant. They can't possibly happen. So it's another way of saying that the cost-benefit ratio at that stage is out of whack in favor of the negative. And that's a reality. And people may still do it for moral purpose, because their peers are urging them on, because there's a leadership pressure and support, whatever it is, but it's going to be a costly period of change. If you're a leader and you're in this triangle, here's the best way of putting it: don't expect many compliments. People are not having a good time at that stage, and I've done it myself. You've done it, Paula, in higher education, where as a dean, bringing about major changes. That first year or two, that there are a lot of complaints, and this is why leaders have to be emotionally intelligent, be somewhat unflappable, be persistent, don't take things too personally, and keep investing in the capacity building. Our work, in effect, takes this line and moves it upward. If you use the change knowledge, it goes like this, right? So that the break-even point is sooner, and we now have in our strategy in Ontario for literacy and numeracy, which I'll talk about in a non-narrow way later, we can see positive change within 6 weeks, plus on the plus side of the equation, by starting here, moving that up, and certainly within a month or two, starting to see on this side of the line and then kind of building up from there. Not that it's finished then, but that's how it goes. So very important, this is a very important way of thinking about change at the early stages of it, so you don't get too frustrated, so you don't get too rational, and that you don't make things worse, and that you have the persistence to get through it. The insights I want to highlight then are these. They go together. The implementation dip is normal and insightful, so we've just said that. A second finding that's pretty strong in the research on psychology, on attitudinal change, for most people, they change their behaviors first before they change their beliefs. It goes back and forth. What this means then, if you want to have someone change, don't expect moral purpose, vision, and data to convince them. Do use that. I'm not saying don't use it, but just don't have high expectations for it. This is why instructional rounds, site visits, anything that where people can see it in action and try it out in a relatively non-threatening period of the stage. That's why risk-taking and non-threat is very important at the early stages, where they can get their behavioral, experiential connection to it, and then you build on it and bring it out and build on it. A lot of our strategies are based on that notion of linking people with peers who are a little farther down the line, respected peers, and the recognition that people have to work through the behavioral as well as the beliefs part. In the behavioral part, let us also say that there's skill development that goes on here. Competency, skills, getting better at it. And when you get better at something, you believe in it more. It's not usually the other way around. The third one, and we have this finding, but Doug Reeves puts it best, the size and the prettiness of the planning document is inversely related to the quality of action and impact on student learning. Again, we all know this intuitively, and why is the planning cycle seductive for those that are in charge? I'm going to say because there are no people on those PowerPoint pages. There are only words and visions, of course, and that they really don't mean very much. This does not say don't do any planning, but it does say you're far better off to have a 5-page plan than you are to have a 55-page plan. This is in Doug's work. They actually found that in schools, that schools that had the most impressive-looking school improvement plans that measured up best to the rubrics on paper were the ones that were least impressive in action. So that you do need to, we use the metaphor that Peters and Waterman used in 1982, ready, fire, aim. You do need to do readiness, but don't get bogged down in elaborate planning at that stage. Next one, shared vision. We all agree that shared vision is key and ownership is key, but the way to think of ownership is that I'm going to say that ownership is as much a process as it is a state. That is, you can measure it on any given day. But what you want to actually do, and the way we think of the Ontario strategy, is are we gaining on the ownership problem? As a result of our strategies over the last 12 months, do we have more ownership in the 4,000 elementary schools than we did 12 months ago, or not? And shared vision comes out of that as well. And then finally, Cotter's reinforcement of the behaviors and beliefs. Feelings are more influential than thoughts at the early stage of change. It's the gut reaction, the feel, and we now know with the brain research that emotions and ideas fuse together, but it's the emotional connection that's more, that's deeper, and that you need to kind of link it to the thoughts that way. If you stand back from these, you could say the theory of action here is really a bias for action. It is a cluster of things that really I could put the ready, fire, aim across the whole thing and say this is ready, fire, aim. And another way of thinking about it is that you get greater clarity by developing skills. It's not that clarity comes first and skills second. Skills come first and clarity, the more skilled you are at something, the more clear you are. This is why we lead with capacity building, which is skill development. And if you have skill development, then clarity, you're likely to have more ownership. So you see where the sequence is going. If you do this together, it's shared ownership. So this is what makes it powerful. It very much is a process of getting better and better at this as you go. Let me take one last part of the change part. We're working with this concept these days of change savviness. What does it mean to be change savvy? What's the essence of that? And what I'd like you to think about for a moment is the last time you were appointed in a new leadership role where you were heading for your first day on the job. Some of you might have been recently, last year, a few years ago, but all of us in this room will have experienced that. And the dilemma for the change, all of us are, when we're appointed to a leadership position these days, are expected to lead change. That's kind of comes with the territory. The dilemma for the new leader is what I call the too fast, too slow dilemma. If you come on too fast and with too many ideas and you're too pushy, the culture will rebel, and guess who's leaving town? The culture doesn't leave town that soon. If you come on too slowly and respect the professionals and say we're going to kind of sort this out, you get absorbed by the culture and not much happens. So you see the press for change here we're seeking. And Federer and Harold have a nice list of change savvy advice. And I want to show this to you now and just ask you to soak it in. I'm only going to make one type of comment about it. They say change savvy leadership's evolved. And listen to the words and the concepts here. Careful entry, listening and learning from those who have been there, engaging in fact-finding and some joint problem solving, carefully rather than rationally. These are their words, not mine. Diagnosing the situation. And the next level here, I won't read all of these, but it's the same notion. What's happening in the change-savvy new leadership question is the way that the leader focuses on building relationships. That's what those are. The spirit of these ideas are, as a new leader, is how do you build relationships as you go, not how do you have the best ideas and come in and save the day. So building relationships, again, we see emotional intelligence. And there's some other insights that come when you start to define this. One is this, that the more that you build relationships, the more challenging you can be. If you don't have a relationship, you better not be too challenging, unless you want to get rid of somebody, and that's a power struggle, and sometimes you have to do that. But trust is another way of putting it. The higher the trust, the more challenging you can be. The lower the trust, the more that challenge backfires. This is all about change, remember, and we'll pull out the lessons of change. So this is some of the things about the insights about change that I want to highlight. Here's, in a way, the punchline. We, all of us, are more likely to behave our way into new ways of thinking than we are to think our way into new ways of behaving. So I'm not putting down ideas, but I want to say that it's the behavioral. And when we say learning by doing, it is not literally learning by doing. It's doing, and it's the reflective thinking part coming out of the doing that the learning is. And if you don't do the doing, you don't have much to think about. That's concrete. So this is very compatible with John Dewey and the learning by doing focus, but just remember the learning by doing is purposeful, and it has to be connected to ideas that you pull out based on the experience. I want to show you a little video clip. We use a lot of clips in our training. I never use a clip more than, I'd say, 3 minutes long. They have to be focused and right on the concept and so forth. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're just instructive. In this one, I'm going to show a clip of a CEO of a borough in England who came, she'll talk for herself in a moment, came as a new person expected to lead changes in the borough. And she spent a year, as she will say, talking about vision all over the place, all kinds of forums and discussions. And then at the end of 12 months of doing that, she takes stock. And let's hear what her experience is.
Communication is a key part of any change management. You've got to get people understanding, what it is you're trying to solve, how you're going to go about doing it, what their role needs to be to bring that change about. And I thought I was really cracking this very well when I was in Newham. I thought I had an inspirational vision that was about the borough and the people in it, which, was what people came to work in the council to address. So I thought it was, running with the flow. But some of the people who I brought in to help work with me said, you really do need to have feedback to find out, if what you're believing to have happened over the last year or so, it really has. I was persuaded that probably was a good idea. So we undertook a series of stakeholder surveys, both from the staff from the front line and from other people we worked with, other agencies, as well as from the public. I couldn't have been more, I don't think, depressed. You could have lifted me off the floor, really, when the staff survey came back. Because basically, well, the good news was that most of them knew I was there. Whereas the previous, there had been a sort of invisibility around the chief executive's role and the perplexity about whether you needed one and what one was for. So at least I'd cracked that, and people knew I'd arrived. But most people had never heard of this strategy. I think there was only about 20% of people heard that there was this vision for putting Newham on the map. And about 80% of those people were absolutely opposed to it. I thought, I spent the last year, I thought consulting people, doing all this grassroots research, really engaging people in a discussion, thinking carefully about how I presented it, talking around the place, all constantly. And I thought, we'd really done it. But, lessons were, you cannot underestimate the number of times you need to give this message. You just have to say the same things, simply and repeatedly, so that the core elements of your values and your vision are clearly understood. And it needs to be very simple. I think secondly, you can't just have a send button, you need a receive button. It's fine for me to have all these great ideas for the borough, but I just arrived, who was I? There were people who'd worked there for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. They had other ideas. You needed to engage them and help, take what they knew about the place, which was quite often very legitimate and hard-won experience. So, engaging with people and also not giving up. My initial reaction was thinking I might as well have gone shopping for the last year for the impact it had had. Being a sort of determined soul, I just went on with it and started finding more creative ways, Life beyond the PowerPoint presentation, is what we need to think about with a lot of different staff groups, engaging them in their own workplaces, doing some team developments, taking seriously their own need to make this vision work for them.
Okay, so a very good, actually, illustration that she spent a year talking it up, talking around the place, tons of communication. It doesn't mean much in the absence of doing anything, right? It can't mean much. And at the end of that year, you heard her say she had 4% of the people that were in favor of it, 20% of 20%. So this is why we want to shift the focus into not spending so much time getting ready, sometime, and much more time learning by doing during implementation on purpose. And that's kind of what the six secrets get at. They all have a bias for action. I want to give you one little other test here at the beginning. I'm going to show a very short clip here and ask you to identify which penguin has been at the latest workshop. So that's your task. All right, no prize for getting it right, I'm sorry. that we will see as we go that leadership has to be energizing. You saw there a lone innovator who had tons of energy, but not only was the lone innovator not energizing, was annoying. Because the rest of us have earned our cynicism the hard way. We don't want a Pollyanna bopping around, reminding us of unreality. But it's not to say don't be enthusiastic, obviously. It's to figure out how to be positively contagious. That positive contagion is what we're talking about. If you don't get movement, it doesn't matter how good the ideas or how right you are. So let's take a look at the 4 middle secrets. Connect peers with purpose. And I'm going to give you the actually the theoretical kind of essence of it first. We didn't do it this way. We did it the other way. That is, we used a lot of this strategy and then pulled out the theory. But here's the theory behind this strategy. All organizations of any complexity suffer by definition from fragmentation and lack of coherence and focus. It's very hard, and you can go to complexity theory or just your common sense to know it's very hard to get alignment, focus, and coherence in a multi-part system when there's lots of politics and personalities. Therefore, the question is, how do you get, I'm going to call it focus and cohesion? And people have tried to get it in 2 ways, both of which have failed. One way is to get it from top down. So the English tried it. They did a damn good job of it, actually. But they didn't quite get it because you can't get focus and coherence by top-down imposition. We know that. So other people have flipped it over and said, let's go for site-based management. Site-based management, that's where the empowerment should be. That's where the local ownership will be. And some people have called that let 1,000 flowers bloom. It turns out when you do site-based management, 1,000 flowers actually don't bloom. Only some of them do. And if you're into gardening, those that do bloom are not necessarily perennial. They come and they go. And a very good system example of this is New Zealand, where we work every year. New Zealand in 1989 got rid of their school districts. They said, we want site-based management. We'll have the Department of Education, and we'll have the 2,100, 2,500 schools, counting the secondary schools. And they'll have a lot more autonomy. Each school will have its own local board of governors and so forth. Now, 20 years later, PISA results show that New Zealand has one of the widest discrepancies between the high and low performing elementary schools, for example, on literacy. 1,500 schools are doing okay and 600 are poor. The gap has actually widened. Site-based management as a system strategy widens the gap between the top and the low performers. So what's the answer if neither work? Our answer in this is in the secret. The first part is not the deepest part of the secret, but I'll mention it. It does require new leadership from the center, a different kind of leadership. The center, I mean the district vis-a-vis its schools, or the state or the province vis-a-vis its districts and schools. And that leadership has to be kind of have a good sense of direction, and in fact assertive leadership, I'm going to say, of a certain kind. And let's think about assertive leadership. Well, it'll come up again. Assertive leadership is being somewhat pushy, but you better have 2 things going for you when you have assertive leadership. One is you better have a lot of good ideas that turn out to be right. Secondly, you need to empower people from day one. That is, whatever your assertiveness is around, you've got a shape or process that shapes it and reshapes it. So that the first part then is to have assertive leadership combined with a very strong sense of 2-way partnership. So you could just, we can give examples of this. I'm just giving you the theory. The 2-way partnership is between the central leadership and the district. So we're talking vertical. The second thing, though, and this is the deeper part of the secret, if you want coherence, and it's a large system, the only way to get it is through purposeful peer interaction. And the reason for that is that you only have so many leaders to go around, but there's lots of peers to go around. So you know that. Let's take a simple example, the collaborative schools, the PLC schools, a good, let's say, professional learning community school. That professional learning community school has a lot of purposeful peer interaction. It's not the leader that causes the coherence. It's the amount of peer interaction that goes on day after day, purposeful peer interaction, that actually causes the coherence. So the strategy, in other words, is indirect. The leader has to be good at facilitating purposeful peer interaction. We'll see an example in a minute. So a leader has to be good at that. Another way of putting it is the leader doesn't even have to be in the room for purposeful peer interaction to have its cohesive focus. So the social glue and the purposeful glue of peer interaction done deliberately is really what makes this secret powerful. And I want to show you a couple of examples of this. Let's take a simple example. We'll just, this is just a 3.5 minute clip, I think, of a school we work with. It's in York Region, just north of Toronto. York Region has 190 schools, very multicultural, 125 languages, huge diversity, lots of immigrants coming. And this is, you'll see a principal and teachers, teacher leaders working on the improvement of writing. And I deliberately start with a simple example. This is not a profound one, but it's powerful in its message for Secret 2. And just think of this, because I'll ask you when we finish, turn to the person beside you and name one thing at least that you saw that you liked. There's only one piece of jargon in this, local jargon. The principal refers to EQAO results. EQAO is Education Quality and Accountability Office, which is the independent agency in Ontario that assesses reading and writing and math for all grade 3 and grade 6 students, 100% of students in those grades each year. So it's a running record, if you like, of that. So take a look. Look for what you see that you like, and I'll ask you to debrief on it and then surface some things with me, and then we'll build on it.
A further examination of the curriculum at Jersey was facilitated by a book study of the professional resource Strategies That Work. This became an opportunity to explore the connections between the writing focus, oral language, and reading comprehension.
Like, is this amazing for classroom management as well as when you're doing your reading time? Like, everybody's focused, everybody's got a role.
Seen here, staff members from all divisions are discussing the reinforcement of comprehension strategies through the use of literature circles across a range of grades. Principal Gord Wagner encourages the sharing of the learning among the staff.
And in the Literacy Collaborative, they're talking about how in the real world, we don't always read novels. We read a lot of shorter chunks of text.
And one of the plans that we've had through the course of this year too is to develop a bit of an in-service for our staff meetings around the area of literature circle use. But I'm wondering too if we could be sort of thinking of how we might want to share this professional learning that we're having, not only share the information we're getting about strategies that work, but also the how to do literature circles. Because I think there's other teachers who are hearing you guys talking about the benefit of empowering kids with this kind of thing in the classroom.
While a focus on the balanced literacy curriculum continued at Jersey Public School, assessment became an important element of their work. The data generated through assessment provided ongoing valuable student information on which next steps for instruction could be based.
Our goal, I think, ultimately is that in EQAO and in classroom assessment and in report cards, that our students are demonstrating much higher caliber of writing measured against the government or the ministry exemplar, writing exemplars that we've used as our standard to get started.
We're trying to identify strengths and areas where students are doing well, and then bringing them even further, and then of course grouping them just like you would for reading, but for specific skills.
So I feel like this focus we have on guided writing, the desire to meet with our grade partners, understand what the ministry exemplar writing samples are, create our own Jersey writing exemplars, and also track students by writing skills so that we can group them into guided writing groups from K to 8 is really making a difference at Jersey Public School.
At Jersey, time is provided for grade-level meetings with administration and teaching staff. These meetings allow for an examination of formative assessment using samples of student writing. This leads to a discussion of ways teacher practice can be designed to respond to student needs.
Is this a good use of our half day together today for you guys to spend an hour or so working through this? So why don't we make sure that that becomes part of the plan?
With regards to the organization, though, with all the point form notes that we've been working on in our shared writing, modeled writing, it's really come out in his writing, I think, especially compared to the last writing something before we worked on that.
Do you think it should be a level 4? Are you wondering? Okay. I'm wondering. Yeah, that's the one that I thought was second highest.
You were debating whether it was
I was debating
High
at first
two or
3 or,
low three?
no,
Oh.
this one,
3 or 4?
yeah, but the one that Heather's looking at, a 2 or a 3.
Okay.
And I'm thinking it's more the 3 minus.
Yeah, that's where I was leaning.
How many times
I
do
know.
they actually read this
An
genre?
exposition.
They
I know.
don't.
You're
So
right, it's true.
I think that's got a big,
Although we were doing in guided reading,
Yes,
we
we
were
were.
showing them exposition books
Mhm.
so that they could get used
So they
to
could get
a
a little
debate
bit-
and making sure that they're able to
Sure.
voice both opinions.
but I'm just thinking as part of
And-
their past and what
Yes.
they've internalized.
It's new, fairly
It's
new this
fairly
year.
new
that's
to
right.
them.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of my writers who are typically stronger
Yeah.
weren't as strong this time, but that student who was typically weaker
I know, I was gonna
is
say, I
stronger.
looked at the name
But I
first
think
on
I might
purpose.
have given extra support during guided writing to that person.
But it's so seamless that we're doing expository reading in our guided reading groups, and we're doing expository writing in our guided writing groups, and it's just happening naturally. We've been tracking the data, and our kids are improving. We're identifying which children in our classrooms with support and intervention and specific teaching can move from a level 2 to a level 3 response. And that's our goal, to see every student achieve and improve.
Okay, just 2 minutes. Person beside you, name one thing you saw you liked. Okay, that should be enough. Let's check in. Let's get a sampling of this. Just raise your hand. I'll point to you. You can call out the one reason that you had or that you heard from the person that was beside you. What did you hear? Just anybody around the room. Just raise your hand. I'll get to you. The very back? Right? Yeah. That time use was focused, very purposeful. Right? Wasn't gobs of time. A couple of times a year they have that half day. It's a couple of times a term, I should say. So that, okay, good use of time by focusing. What else did you see? Yeah, definitely. Remember, peer interaction, it's purposeful peer interaction. It's focused. These strategies reinforce each other that way. What else did you see? Yep.
We talked about how the principals are encouraging the teachers to share the ideas that become the catalyst for change, as opposed to
Yeah. So let's think about the principal. There's lots of work done on reviews of principal, and I'm thinking of Vivienne Robinson's recent meta review, where she did a review of the studies in the world that where she titled it "The Role of the Principal in Relation to Student Outcomes, the Learning Outcomes." And she found 5 factors that were important. One of the 5 was twice as powerful as any of the other 4. And it was this: the degree to which the principal participates as a learner along with teachers in figuring out how to do this. You see that phrase, participates as a learner. That principal was not bossy, but doesn't have to be the expert in literacy, obviously. Some teachers will be better at that, but does have to be the expert in shaping the process. Has to be really in there as a lead learner, an actual learner. Okay, anything else that you saw? Yep.
The time to share student work.
Yeah, the time to share and the focus on student work. If you think of assessment of student work, there's a two-way street between assessment and instructional improvement. Right? Assessment causes instructional improvement when you set it up that way, and instructional focus, you need to assess it. That school doubled its proficiency scores in writing in 3 short years. They went from 32%, we have a fairly high standard for proficiency in writing, 32% approximately of its grade 3 and grade 6 to double that in 3 years. And you heard the principle, track the data, see what's doing. We didn't see a lot of the instruction there, but they were using those results of students to track back how should we change instruction and how can we pinpoint it to the named student, so to speak. All right, so that's within the school. One other piece of secret too is this is not about just peer interaction within the school. That the strategy very much is built on broadening the purposeful interaction across schools. And that school is one of 145 elementary schools in the York Region. I'm going to say that virtually all the schools, all 145, are pretty much like that because they've used purposeful peer interaction. I'm going to give you one example of it. This is, for example, school I think the way to put it in a pushy way is that no matter how good a school is, we can never conceive of a school as just good on its own. It has to be part of a network. Or to put it still another way, every school that's doing something has an obligation to learn from other schools and contribute to the learning of other schools. We can debate this later. I'm talking about the norms and the values here. In the same way, incidentally, within the school, the collaborative school, the PLC school basically says every teacher has a responsibility to contribute to the learning of other teachers as well as to learn from them. You can't be an isolated, autonomous teacher, no matter how good you are, otherwise the system won't improve. So in York Region, every school is in a cluster. They have a lot of lateral learning. I'm going to show you a year-end version of this, which is called the Learning Fair. And I won't process it the same way, I just want to illustrate this. This is each June, all schools in the district, 190 or so, including all secondary schools, prepare a 25-minute multimedia presentation that focuses on what they started out to do, what their goals were for the year, what strategies they used, what impact they've arrived at, what lessons they learned, and what's next. And that these schools there's a design for it and a guideline for how to do it. And they're in 2 different days because of the large number of the schools. And I'm just going to give you, it'll show better than I'm describing it, but I need to give the background. This is what it typically looks like. The person at the beginning speaking is Bill Hogarth, who's the superintendent of education. So think of this now, big district. This is a big urban district, basically, with almost 200 schools now. And it is focusing as a purposeful peer interaction for the system as a whole. So let's look at the Learning Fair.
This is a fair. Not an affair, a fair. It is absolutely amazing what I've already seen. And I've been to at least and observed at least 6 or 7 of what's already going to be going on throughout the day. And some of what you've done, your work, is spectacular. If you think about it, it really is an opportunity for us to self-reflect, to take a look at ourselves and say, how have we done as professionals, but just as importantly, how we combine that with the difference that we're making for our students.
I invite you, as you're presenting your story and the journey that you've been on this year, to obviously celebrate the successes and the steps that you've taken, but also I know that there'll be a real honesty with also sharing with others, what have the challenges been? You know, what are the things, that you're still grappling with, the questions that you still have? Because that's really the fuel for our ongoing work. And then secondly, as you listen to the stories of others, step back and celebrate what they've accomplished, because this really is something that we're doing together. And think about the questions that they're raising, the challenges that they're facing, and what are the implications of those for you as well in your own work.
We're having a great time talking with other teachers and getting ideas from them. The networking is invaluable.
And in a small community like Stouffville, where we have a few feeder schools and one local high school, we can't really think of ourselves as being only this person's teacher and that person's teacher, because they're all our students.
2 years ago, people would talk about the strategies they were using in the books that they got their strategies from. What I heard this year was people talking about their students, talking about their student data, and talking about things that they were doing as a result of analyzing their student data.
We also have as mentioned, the highest ESL population in York Region.
Okay, every time that they would analyze a word or attack a word, and we'd look at different strategies, they would be responsible for putting up those words up on a word wall, and literally we had an entire room covered with those little sheets of paper, and the visuals of the word wall actually helped them retain that information.
The main message, and it kept coming up again and again, that all students can learn given the time and the right support.
It's one of those days that you wish you had 36 hours.
What we've got here is a summary of the main data that we focused on for this school year. It includes, of course, data from the OSSLT, but something I'd like to really point out is that we went beyond the results because we also really wanted to focus on student information.
They really have a wisdom to share, and they're open about their learning, and that is wonderful because we're learning from each other, energizing.
How do you energize yourself? This morning it was asked. Well, part of that energy comes from sitting in, for example, in a case management meeting and seeing kids move forward. It takes a whole school to move the kids, and this presentation represents all the good work.
Okay, so we won't process this the same way, but here's what I think are the outcomes of the Learning Fair, the strategy that they've been using for a few years. One caution, you don't start with a Learning Fair, you start by doing something, because you need something to share. And then later on, and it's not only getting the substance going, but it's getting the trust built, because trust has to be part and parcel of being able to be this open. It forces schools to explain themselves. I use that deliberately. If you have to articulate and show what you've been doing transparently to your colleagues, for example, it's pretty demanding. Celebration, if you go to those learning fairs, high fives, balloons, great sense of spirit, learn new ideas from other schools, friendly competition to outdo each other. This is what I say, who's the family and who's the enemy? The family should be schools in your own district. The enemy can be private schools, the newspaper, Finland, who outdoes everybody else, but not you, not the immediate family. It fosters district identity, not because of it's what I call the we identity, but clearly knowledge is flowing a lot better outside the school now, as well as inside the school. And the more that you see the Learning Fair representation, the more information and pressure you have for internally developing your PLC. PLCs don't develop very well in a vacuum. They do develop if they're interactive in the bigger sense. So the knowledge flows, but the identity is a powerful thing because it means that you're identifying with a purpose and other people in an entity bigger than yourself, within the school, within the district, and we also have strategies that foster this district across districts in the province, so that this sense of identity is very powerful. It's not because here that you fall in love with your leaders. It's not a hierarchical identity. There'll be some of that. It's because you fall in love with your peers across the whole, where everybody's in this enterprise to public education to make a difference. The moral purpose comes here, but it's not just words. It's grounded in the doing part of this. So I spent a lot of time on that just because it's such an important one. This secret 3, now we'll move more quickly, and I will leave a half hour where we'll just delve into this with your questions. The 2 questions I usually ask you to think about. A positive question, what insights are you getting from this? 1 or 2. Secondly, worry list question, what puzzle or question mark is kind of foremost in your mind? So that's how we'll attack that eventually. But capacity building, the full secret goes like this. Capacity building trumps judgmentalism. So this is capacity building, just a simple definition. It's developing the competencies, not just individually, but collectively. And I usually think of the knowledge and competencies in 2 bins. that we connect. One bin is instructional, so all the things about teaching and learning and instruction. And the other bin is about change. How do you develop collaboration? How do you deal with overload? How do you deal with the outside pressures? How do you deal with resistance within the staff? So you've got the knowledge, the instructional bin and the change bin, and in our training we actually are integrating the two, and when you put those two together you can get some development. This interesting word, judgmentalism, it actually doesn't exist, but I needed the ism part. Judgmentalism is when you perceive something as ineffective, but you end up doing it wittingly or unwittingly in a pejorative way. You convey judgmentalism, however softly or hardly, it's part of that. And I'm going to say it's bad. It's bad not because you're right or wrong, you can be 100% right, it's bad because it doesn't work. And so this is why we've been pushing and trying to figure out better versions of non-judgmentalism, where you still want to get at situations that need improvement. You don't want to sweep it under the rug. You want to be transparent about that, which is secret 5. But you don't want to end up being pejorative about it. Here's a little piece from Pfeffer and Sutton. Deming said this, eons ago. Deming said, if you want improvement, you have to drive fear out of the organization, is what he said. Pfeffer and Sutton in the knowing-doing gap say the problem with fear is that it interferes with using knowledge, which will be needed for improvement, for 2 reasons. Fear promotes short-termism. How do I get this year's results looking best, even if I have to fudge them? And it promotes also individual selfishness. You get less generous if you're in a climate of fear, more looking after number 1, less likely to reach out. The question of pejorative, I just Googled it just to get a better notion. It's not a word we use every day, but it's something that has negative connotations, tending to disparage or belittle, either by your words or your actions. Now I'm going to give you a tricky question, and I'd like you to think about it and talk to the person beside you for a few minutes about it. Is it possible to perceive something as ineffective and not be judgmental about it? And what I'd like you to come up with is yes or no, and the reason attached to the yes or the no. There's no actually single right answer to this. It's quite, it's a way of getting into this secret better. So think about this, jump around. It's not clear cut. It's an interesting question. Can you perceive something or see something that's clearly ineffective and not be judgmental about it? So talk about it, and then I'll ask you for some responses. Okay, let's come together. I'm just going to ask you, when you raise your hand, to tell us the yes or the no, whatever you came up with, and what reason did you have for arriving at that conclusion. So anybody, again, it's ins and outs of this issue. Go ahead.
Yes, for two reasons. One reason was apathy, and another one was empathy.
What was the first reason?
Apathy.
Apathy?
If you don't have a stake in it,
Okay.
it's a little easier to disconnect yourself from the situation. And there's empathy, where you're trying to really study why something isn't effective.
Okay. So that's an interesting, so the answer is yes in this case. The apathy is an interesting one because it says if you don't care very much, you're not judgmental. And I'm going to say that the change agent with a strong sense of moral purpose, moral imperative, and sense of urgency, all the more has to be non-judgmental. So that's for reasons that we'll get to. So, and the empathy very clearly, even if you weren't apathetic, and you had strong sense of purpose, and you had strong empathy, you would come across as less judgmental, as you said. Okay. Others, yes or no, and why? Yep. Right. Okay, so, right, so you're saying yes, and in a sense you're saying it's all in the attitude. If you don't have a blaming attitude, that is your theory of change tells you not to blame. Okay, so, yep, okay. Anybody else come up with variations? Yep. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So if trust, this is why Tony Bright and Barbara Schneider found in their Trust in Schools in Chicago, the higher the trust in schools, the more likely there would be action taken in the face of ineffective teaching. The higher the trust, the more the action, because it was relatively non-judgmental. So what, here's we're going to build on this in a second, but here's my way of putting it. If you're an English teacher, the answer to this is no, right? Judgment is judgment. Look it up in the dictionary. If you're a change agent, the answer to this must be yes, because the secret of the secrets is what is motivational. Whatever you do, does it end up motivating people to put in the effort to change the situation? Now, I'm not saying, in actions that are clearly abusive, you might take different action. I'm talking about the broad base of improvement. And let's just take a look. In the longer workshops, I'd have you interview each other on this, but I'm going to do it myself with you. Think of, but do this in your own mind, at least for starters. Pick any one of these quadrants where you were on the receiving end of feedback or not, and think of yourself only in one of the quadrants. So I'm just going to run them through. This one is fairly easy. You received direct feedback in an actual situation and you felt belittled. Or maybe your example is you received direct feedback and you didn't feel belittled. So if either of those fits, gravitate towards that. This is a little more tricky because it's indirect feedback or no feedback. So I'm going to ask you to think of a situation where you didn't get direct feedback, it was sort of in the air somewhere, but it wasn't very direct and you felt belittled. Or you didn't get any feedback, for example, and you felt okay. So you're going to, and I'm going to run through the quadrants in a second, but I'm assuming now that you are gravitated towards only one of those four, thinking of your own self. And now I'd like you to, before I talk some more, to attach a word to the feelings that you have being in that quadrant. Just in your own mind, you don't have to talk about it. A single word that would describe how you feel being in that quadrant. So let's take this one, I think I have the order right. Indirect, you receive, the feedback isn't very direct and you felt belittled. The word I'm going to use is frustrated. I mean, you might have variations on the theme. You know there's something wrong, but nobody's giving you the direct goods on it, and you feel put down because communication isn't there. Let's take the next one where there's direct feedback and you felt belittled. Here's my word, variations on the theme, alienated. You didn't take too kindly to the way it was said, or maybe it's part of the way your personality is, but whatever the case is, you're alienated from it. The bottom left-hand one you might not think exists because you feel okay and there's no feedback. And I'm going to say that this is the history of the teaching profession. This is the individual professional autonomy of the teacher behind the classroom door who does not get feedback and feels okay. The problem is that students are not learning as much as they should. It's a live and let live. And it's interesting that in the PISA studies, Andreas Schleicher, who is the head of the PISA studies, the recent research is on what makes teachers satisfied on the job. And one of the things that they found in the higher performing countries was that teachers getting feedback on their work was part of the satisfaction scale. Obviously, I'm saying non-judgmental feedback. And so this one I'm going to put aimless. This is inertia. There's no press here. There's bad press here. There's indirect press here. There's zero press here. And then the one that we want to strive for, I'm going to say, is getting good feedback going and having people motivated to act on it. And that's what this, that's why this is important. So, if you want to improve somebody's teaching and you're in a leadership position in relation to that, the worst thing you can do early in the relationship is to roll your eyes at what you're seeing, or the equivalent. There's lots of ways to roll your eyes even if you don't. And the more moral purpose you are, the less apathetic you are, the more you want to roll your eyes, because this is so important. I'm just saying, train yourself not to do that. In Richard Elmore's instructional rounds work, I know, Paula, you were a bit part of that in Connecticut. Their book, the first author's name is Elizabeth Siddies. I'm sure some of you have it if you're looking at instructional changes. They call it instructional rounds. And they say the hardest norm to get established, and the most important first norm to get established, because they're observing teaching, is they say to be descriptive, not judgmental. Not be evaluative to begin with, but to be descriptive. And to park your evaluation or your judgmentalism over here while you look at the descriptive part. And this is, again, the skill of the change agent. I'm just going to put the implication here. As a leader, if you want to be effective, you have to practice non-judgmentalism when you're giving feedback. You still want to give feedback, but practice, practice, practice not being judgmental. And then secondly, we haven't talked about this, but if you're in a leadership position and you want feedback from those you're leading, you better practice non-defensiveness, because the first few times if you're defensive, you won't get feedback anymore. It'll still be there, but it won't be coming towards you. It'll be elsewhere. So this is a very important part of Secret 3, being non-judgmentalism. Here's a quote from Toyota. Toyota's culture has been studied a lot. Really good analysis by Leiker and Meyer in their 3 books on Toyota's culture. The objective, and they're quoting a leader in Toyota, is not to identify whom to blame when something goes wrong, but to figure out how the system can correct it. That's their prevailing attitude. If someone screws up 25 times in a row, they'll have a different attitude. But the prevailing, predominant first attitude is this is not a blame culture. And the reason for that, I'm saying, is it's the secret to getting motivational change. So let's capacity building. I want to sort of do a transfer into Secret 4. I love this quote from a CEO. It's in my book, The 6 Secrets That You Have. A CEO who was talking about hiring people in his company. And I just want to give you the last sentence there. When we're hiring people, he says, we look for people who light up when they're around other talented people. We don't look for people who have the best resumes. We look for people who are most connected to learning and want to connect laterally to other good people. And you can see where we're heading for this. The transition to Secret 4 is this. Capacity building you need to get in 2 ways. One is who you hire, and second one is what you do after they're hired. So you can get a head start on capacity building every opportunity that you have to hire. When I was Dean of Education at the University of Toronto, that first stagnant faculty, we were able to hire 25 faculty in 3 years. We looked for faculty like this, not the ones that had the best research resumes. They had to be good at research, but the ones that were also comfortable in schools doing their work and wanted to work together with other people, other faculty and so forth. So that, getting them in the door in the first place. Now, secret 4 is about what happens after they arrive in the organization. And I usually use, I'm not going to use this one. I usually use Maurice Chevalier's song to illustrate this. His song, one of his songs we all remember was, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they see Paris? Well, this version is, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they see the farm? Right? In other words, you hire good people, the farm is no good. Guess what happens when good people go to a bad farm? They leave. And when the word gets around, they stop coming. So secret 4 is actually the hardest of them all because it has to do what you do with it has to do with the culture of what you do day after day. Secret 4 is what happens in between workshops. It's the day-to-day learning of within the organization. And here's Toyota again. Liker and talk about it this way. Look at the last part. The biggest difference is the depth of understanding among Toyota employees about their work. I would say the depth of shared understanding. That's what they're talking about. How do you get deep shared understanding? Impossible to get it at a workshop. Impossible. You can only get deep shared understanding by learning in context, by the day after day. You saw it in Jersey, a little bit of it at least. That's the only way to get it. And that's why the day-to-day culture of learning, that's why the collaboration we talked about, that's why the other secrets feed into this one to make this point. I know you're working on instructional issues here, and I certainly recommend Elizabeth City's book. I'm sure you're using it. But I want to put it this way. I want to put it in terms of what I'm going to call the newish concepts, the first 3 in particular. This one isn't new. And I want to talk about this cluster briefly and its relationship to this. So these are concepts having to do with instructional change. We wrote about them in Breakthrough, that book on Focused. And the first 3 actually do form one concept. So non-negotiables are those instructional strategies that are so proven that teachers should not have a choice not to use them. I don't mean that they're stagnantly proven, because you always want to look at them. And this is where I go back to assertive leadership. It's all right to be assertive about things that work and that have evidence-based decision making. So we shouldn't be shy about being that assertive. Secondly, the strategies have to have greater specificity and precision. The instructional strategies. You can't just say it's good to collaborate or it's good to give feedback to students. It better have specificity and precision. And the third is the high yield strategies. John Hattie, our colleague in Australia, wrote a nice, New Zealand I should say, wrote a very nice book he published a few months ago called Visual Learning. 2 words, visual learning, in which he's taken his last 10 years of research on meta-analysis of instructional strategies, and he's got, 30 instructional strategies, you would all know the names of them, and arrays them according to whether these are high yield must-haves, middling, you put in the effort, you get the results, and then at the other end he has disasters, those that actually do more harm than good. So sorting out the high yieldness, if you like. I'm going to give you one phrase, one concept for the first 3, and this is to say you need to be relentlessly consistent around these 3 concepts. Schools need to be relentlessly consistent. Then, second point, if you build up your relentless consistency, do you not crowd out creativity? And the answer is you can if you're only relentlessly consistent, but all the good organizations that are like Toyota and Southwest Airlines, and there's 26 others, as well as the schools I'm talking about, they're in the business of continuous improvement, which means 2 things. They get better at the good things, relentless consistency, and they add to them through innovation. So one way to put it, oversimplified, is to make the point, is you could be relentlessly consistent all morning and be innovative all afternoon. You don't have to choose to be only one or the other. You need the balance and the integration of the two, and that's what makes it work. What I think the Elizabeth City book is about, the instructional rounds, is this. It's getting serious about relentless consistency while at the same time focusing on continuous improvement. And I usually bring this home, emphasize this. Tiger Woods just won another tournament on Sunday, so it's appropriate. Accenture has about 20 of these ads or more now. They show Tiger Woods in great golfing situations or problematic ones, and they give a caption, usually with a caption that adds up to 100%. And here's the one here, you see it. These are their words, not mine. Relentless consistency, 50%. Willingness to change, equal, 50%. Tiger Woods has been a pro for 13 years. He revamped his swing twice, fundamentally, in those 13 years. He was already great to begin with. Each time he revamped it, his performance went down a bit before it went up, implementation dip. It went up because he got relentlessly, consistently better at it. But he's still not going to be complacent with it. He's going to look for the continuous improvement. Sometimes those continuous improvements are refinements, and some of them are revamping, more radical. So precisely the point I'm making on this. So let's just move a little more quickly here. I'm going to give you something about transparency, and then I'm going to ask you to raise some questions there so we make sure we have enough about what we've done in this for. The transparency rules is, the transparency, first let me say, is about results and about practice. Not one or the other, but both. And I just want to give you a little video clip here to prove that transparency does exist. So let's take a look at this short video clip.
Scusi, buon uomo. Mi sa dire l'ora, per favore?
5:35.
È sicuro?
36.
Grazie. Ha mangiato il ciuchino, eh?
No,
Senta, mi sa dire che ore sono adesso?
allora. 7:15.
Ma sono le 7:15 spaccate? Incredibile. Ma lei come fa a leggere l'ora delle palle del ciuchino, scusi?
No, io le alzo. Sotto c'è il cameriere.
So that proves that transparency does exist. I mentioned that transparency is about outcomes, including disaggregated data, raise the bar, close the gap of subgroups. But especially as well, it's about practice, what sociologists call the deprivatization of practice for teaching. We have been writing about it, I guess, 50 years now, deprivatization of teaching, which is when it becomes normal and desirable for teachers to observe each other teaching and others to observe it, learn from it, and get better at it. And so this is an important part of transparency. Here's a quote from a reformer in medicine: we can substitute education. To fix education, we need to do two things: measure ourselves and be open about what we're doing. Interacting with the other secrets. Classroom improvement. These are the conditions under which I think a teacher will improve his or her teaching. Transparency, you have to know what's going on in that classroom and what results they're getting or not getting. You have to have an attitude of non-judgmentalism, and you have to provide good help. Those three things, you do those, that's what we do, and you get classroom improvement. It's not quite as simple as that, and it's not a one-to-one relationship all the time. One way I want to express it, we use, I'm going to be brief about this, we use the phrase statistical neighbors because we've been promoting, as most people want to do, comparing apples with apples. So you want to know what schools facing similar circumstances are doing better, but you also want to know the big picture. Here, I just give you, by micro I mean the school use, and by macro I mean the district or state use. Here's our guidelines, in fact our practice about that. Micro use is this. We want school leaders and teacher leaders in the schools to do the following three things. I'm going to say almost in this order, although they get seamless after a while. One is to get in the habit of comparing yourself with yourself. Where were you last year on given measures? Where were you the year before? Where are you heading? So you get that sense of reasonable question. Are we improving in our own terms from our own starting point? Secondly, you want them to compare themselves with other schools in similar circumstances. How are we doing compared to other schools? Thirdly, you do want people along the way to have an eye to the, I'll say, the bigger benchmark, the external standard, 100% success, or what the best schools are doing. The macro use, and this is our, at the center, I'm going to call the province, the premier, equivalent of the governor, the minister of education, and the deputy minister, who's the state commissioner, basically. We all have this attitude at the macro level, and it goes like this. We will never condone league tables, the English call them league tables, which is displaying schools' performance independent of their context. Newspapers can do that. We won't do it. It's now not a bother. I mean, it happens, but nobody pays attention to it. It's not our policy. Secondly, we'll never take 1 year's results too literally. We want to see 3-year windows, like is it moving, stagnant, or declining? Seems fair enough again. 1 year can be blippy, but now that we have cumulative data, it's easy to look at the 3 years, the 3 previous years. And thirdly, when we see low performance, we always assume that it's a job for capacity building. We never assume it's a blame situation. Even though it might be, it's just not a good strategy. So we lead with capacity building. That's what's built into there. So this quartet, and I'm just going to stop here in about 2 minutes. Just taking these 4, and I'll just ask you to debrief and then raise some questions with me. The secrets, what I call the quartet, they're like a symphony. No one secret should stand out above the other as a strategy. It's like a Mercedes engine. You shouldn't be able to hear any one sound from it. It's congruent. Seamless, powerful, pleasant to the ear and to the heart. It's got to be really these 4 together. You can't do one. If you miss one, you miss more than 25%. And if you miss 2, you miss more than 50%. So think about what I've said, and I'll just ask you in the next 3 or 4 minutes with the person beside you again, in terms of what I have said, let's put it this way. 2 questions. In terms of what I've said or displayed, what has become clearer to you about getting school and district improvement? What has become clearer? Secondly, what puzzle or problem still is bubbling around in your mind? Question mark, puzzle, disagreement. So think about it in those 2 terms. Have that discussion. We'll pull out some questions, and then I'll do a wrap-up after that. So go ahead. All right, let's do get together. Let's start with two of the positive ones, then we'll mix it up. So the positive side was what has become clear, what resonated with you, what connected. So let me hear two of those. Go ahead. That's right. It takes a long time, but not inordinately long, actually. It's if it takes longer if you blow it early, right? It takes longer to fix it if you blow it. And so we have stay the course, persistence, and that frustration of the first couple of years. When you get the breakthrough, although I think there are cycles, when you get the breakthrough, there's a surge of energy, and it's less than 4 years that you get the breakthrough. So it's not that long. Yeah. That's right, yeah. Yep, that communication during implementation is more important than communication prior to it. Big strategy, learn about implementation during implementation. Strategies to do that, because that's where the substance is. And there's a lot of wasted time on strategic planning, vision building, being negative. You know, I sometimes say facetiously, if you're out to get someone, you don't complain about lack of time, right? You do it, because it's important. I'm talking about positive actions on that. Okay, let's mix it up. Question marks as well as things that connected. I know about wait time. Yes?
The issues of getting the naysayers along, or the
Yeah.
difficult people, or even a little cluster of difficult people.
Yeah.
Talk some more about it.
Yeah, that's a kind of a workshop in its own right, but a few things. One is you cannot make people change, right? Secondly, my non-judgmentalism gets your foot in the door better that way. And I'm going to show you something on Love Your Employees in a minute of a teacher leader who turned a teacher around that way. Once you get once you get going and you build up trust, you can be more challenging, including firing people. I've taken action against ineffective professors, even though they had tenure, but only after trying a lot of other things and having a lot of other constructive things, And then it's amazing how the peers let you get away with that, because they know. They do know. And so you've got to get in the position of letting the peers let you get away with the harsher action. But I'm going to say that 90% of the people, I think, turn around anyways with the right strategy. And peers are, remember, we've got peers working for us here. Those peers that are lateralizing are providing both support and pressure. There's lots of pressure in peer interaction. And a lot of people who don't change are the naysayers, either because they don't know how to do it and they camouflage it by being against it, the fear of change, or they've had a history of negativism, they've been mistreated, which is secret one, and therefore they've built up a kind of cynicism. And so we're talking about changing that around, but changing the climate towards more positive is a fundamental part of that. That's why Secret 4 is the hardest, because you're changing the climate of the organization towards a more supportive but equally challenging and therefore more satisfying when you get results. Okay, other comments? Yeah? Well, I think a few things. One is you can go to Elizabeth City, Richard Elmore's book, and read their chapter on what the examples of being judgmental, or what they call evaluative, and so you start to cognitively. Pardon? The book is called Instructional Rounds, R-O-U-N-D-S, Harvard Education Press, 2009. Elizabeth City, the first author, C-I-T-Y. So you can, that's one thing. Secondly, it's actually, you can do it by making explicit the norm of non-judgmentalism. Making it explicit. That is, you state this is our norm. I mean, that's what Elmore et al. Do. That's what we do. If you want norms, there needs to be a small number of norms that you say, around here, we don't judge each other. But around here, we're also transparent. Think of those two things together. Because if you have judgmentalism, you better not have transparency. If you have transparency, but you don't do anything about it, that's no good either. So we're talking about a small number of norms, only 6 of them in my case, where you really do that. And then you can ask, if you're a leader, you can say, my job is to be non-judgmental, etc. This is what it looks like. This is what we need to practice. I need to model it. If I'm not modeling it, tell me. So you invite commentary on it. But mostly, I think you know. Every time, you usually know when you've treated someone in a way that they feel belittled. You actually usually know that because you sense it or you get at it. Another way, of course, is increase your emotional intelligence, which is really, the Dan Goleman, empathy. The more empathetic you are, the less judgmental you're likely to be. Remember, being empathetic doesn't mean you agree with the person. It means you understand how they got that way. You understand what they represent, not that you agree with them. Okay, other comments around the room? Okay, a couple more things to do then. I want to go to Love Your Employees, Secret 1. This is, we'll get at this a few ways. Anytime I see a document that says children first, I get worried because I wonder where teachers are in the pedestal, right? So it doesn't, so where are teachers in the pedestal? And you know that little book that was written, I forget the author, if you don't feed the teachers, they'll eat the children, right? That's what this is about. It's about love your employees, and we can get at it, and there's a discussion in the book about it. I'd like, 50 years ago, Douglas McGregor in his Human Side of Enterprise wrote about Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X, he said, is you make a priori, low expectations judgments about what others will do. The same applies to students, incidentally. So you come in with an attitude that you don't expect much. Theory Y, the opposite to that, you expect that under the right conditions, people will actually rise to the occasion, be creative, and do things. It's not so much that Theory X and Theory Y is 100% predictable, but it's centrally predictable. It's centrally self-fulfilling. I put it another way. In theory, if you're a Theory X leader, there'll always be someone who has intrinsic motivation that will still be great, even though you're mishandling it, so to speak. If you're theory Y, there'll always be somebody who will goof off. So it's not like this is 100%, but if you think of it, this is a very important, and all of the organizations, and the ones I looked at, and I'm just read on the way down, Isidore Sharp's account of the Four Seasons, how he built the Four Seasons. Pleasing the customer was one of his foundation. The other one, as a CEO, was pleasing employees. He treated them equally, actually, and he got enormous success. Every organization that gets any success values their employees as well as their customers, so to speak, to use that language. Here's a question. This goes back to the resistance one, and I'm going to get at a couple of ways. I'd like you to think about almost anybody in this room, I'll say, can pick up an example that they've been part of, leading, or they've observed another leader do, where you've seen somebody who was not engaged, kind of cynical or skeptical at least, and because of the circumstances, they turned around and now they're a champion of the effort. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We're working right now on a new way of getting at this that we call motion leadership. And motion leadership is the concept of how do you move individuals and organizations and systems? What kind of strategies will move? And this is a classic turnaround or movement situation. So I'd like you to think of that in your own mind. And I'm going to show you a clip here of it, but just dwell on it just for a minute and figure out just one or two things that were critical to that turnaround equation. You might have been the leader and you did them, or you might have observed a great other leader that you were working for and saw him or her do them. So I'm going to show you now a little clip from, this is a teacher leader in England, and it speaks for itself, and we'll pull out the meaning of it. 3 minutes, difficult situation, a junior teacher leader facing a veteran who was against, not interested in change, and let's see how she handles it.
One of my first experiences of leadership role was actually as a year leader in a middle school, and I actually had to lead a group of more experienced older teachers, and one in particular was quite averse to anything to do with change particularly. She was quite obstinate in actually trying new ideas and could be quite difficult in staff meetings. So I knew that I had to win her over really to be able to lead within that group. So I really had to think hard about how I actually managed that person. And so what I looked for were things that that particular teacher was very good at. And in finding some things that she was good at, because she was very committed, she was a science teacher, it was just that she could be difficult sometimes, I suppose, in trying the new ideas, as I said. And so what I did was find something that she was good at, and I actually then asked her to support me in planning for the whole group in that particular aspect. And she actually was really good at doing that, and she appreciated being asked. And so I was showing that I valued her experience, and I was also modelling the fact that everybody within that relationship, that partnership, if you like, was important and had something to play, a part to play in that. And so we moved forward from there. And when I began to actually suggest new ideas, my way of managing that was to say, why don't I try this, and then if it goes wrong, I'll take the responsibility for it, but let me try it, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the results. And so it took away her fear in a way of change, and also took away the responsibility if it went wrong. And I would try an idea and come back to it and talk to the team about it, and when it worked well, they could see it worked well, and we were able to move on. So I suppose in a way, the lesson that I learned from that was that one needs to build credibility, one needs to build positive relationships to be able to lead people. Positive relationships is a really key lesson there. And one needs to be able to show some humility yourself with others, that you're not always the person who knows everything, but actually you can support people then once you've got them on board, you've brought them on board, you can support them. And then at the point at which a challenge needs to happen, you've built a positive relationship and it's not seen as such a threat.
Okay, so several things there that really in a nutshell are great. One is showing empathy. Second is taking your time at the beginning, don't rush it. Third is looking for a way in, a linkage. Fourth is, and I think this is absolutely crucial, when something new was being tried, to take the blame yourself and the risk and protect the person from that at the beginning, because the biggest problem for most people is the fear of change. The leader has to take the blame even when they're not to blame, so to speak, directly. At the beginning, I'm talking about, because of this. And the last one, really important, she said, once you've built the relationship, you can be more challenging. You can get away with it. Don't be challenging if you don't have a relationship, because you won't be heard. It'll be the opposite. It'll be a fight. Build a relationship and ramp up challenging as the relationship gets built. That's the kind of sequence that's happening here. If we take this love your neighbor's one, here's the way I usually kind of capture it. Motivational work. What is motivational work? This is just a commonsensical list. But this is why love your employees. This is what it looks like, and this is what it contributes into in terms of improvement of the organization. The work has to be meaningful, but it has to be accomplishable. No Child Left Behind 2014 is fantasy. So it doesn't have any meaning, doesn't have any credibility. Enables development. This is the capacity building. The organization is investing in the development of the people on the job. Sense of camaraderie, very powerful, secret two. And being well led. Being well led means leaders who can do these three things, who can foster these three things. If we look at the empirical evidence, and I like this book, you'll see it summarized in my book, that Sisodi and his group did, where they identified those companies that had a humanistic core by name. There are 28 of them, they're listed in my book. And they gave their book a cute title, Firms of Endearment. And they said these two things here. It wasn't really just about employees, it was about the cluster of people, multiple stakeholders. And secondly, here we go back to change, experiential, social, not just the ideas. And so they identified these companies, 28 they ended up with, and then they said, well, we haven't looked at financial performance. Let's give ourselves the hardest possible test. We'll compare our 28 companies by name with the 11 great companies in Jim Collins' Good to Great. Just the 11 great ones, and pound for pound, so to speak. And this is what they found, just as on the money, the bottom line. Yes, the great organizations were well above average, but these were triple or almost double the performance on the bottom line of money. We could substitute student achievement there, make the same point. The secret one, when it's embedded with the other secrets, produces results because it motivates people to put in the effort individually and collectively to get the results. That's what it does. Last point about system leadership. I'm going to give you a quick encapsulation of the Ontario strategy. We wrote a bit about it in, it's on my website, but it's all, you can download the PDF. The June 17th or whatever issue of Ed Week, I had an article with Ben Levin that said the 6 fundamentals of whole system reform. So it's our version of this. But I'm going to give you a couple of things here. One is about the Ontario strategy. Remember, this has to do with transforming the entire public system of 5,000 schools in 72 districts. And this is what we do, the combination. Relentless commitment and a guiding coalition at the top. This is getting the top, I'm now talking province-wide, which is the Premier and the Minister, the Deputy Minister, myself as advisor and a few others, to make sure that they have a common approach to what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it, which is capacity building. We work a lot on it. We meet every 6 weeks as a group, including the Premier. This is the Governor sitting down every 6 weeks saying, what are you doing? And leading that meeting. So working away at that. A small number of ambitious goals deeply pursued. We have 3 core ones, literacy, numeracy, and high school graduation. There's a lot of innovation in there. Literacy and numeracy, I call it the evolution of literacy and numeracy into 21st century skills. So they're not the narrow version. They're part and parcel of the 21st century skills. Make capacity building the driver. Establish a user-friendly database whose main role is to develop capacity. I didn't talk a lot about the ins and outs of using data. Then a few more elements, not too many. Ubiquitous intervention. We're always intervening or helping people intervene. Jersey School, you saw them intervening at the individual student level around writing. We have a turnaround school strategy that's based on this. Specific strategies to learn about implementation during implementation. A whole bunch, I just named one. Schools on the move. Our Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat who oversees this identifies schools that had 3 years running success in their own terms on literacy and numeracy. They're identified by name. There's 145 on the list now. They're published, and the money is given for other people to learn from them. The strategy is not, why don't you be more like your brother? That's not the strategy. The strategy is, this is hard work. Some people are figuring it out. Let's take a look. And then focus on the whole system, not just the laggards. Build the entire teaching profession. We put equal emphasis on a good school that's cruising as we put on a school that's struggling and not getting any far. Because it's the whole system that you pay attention to. I don't want to, I'll just do this as well. I know there's a lot of information, but incentives that work. This is a big problem that we all have and that you have, which is, and Arnie Duncan's working on this from the federal level, how do you improve the quality of the teaching profession? And I'm going to say that most of the incentives that people think about actually don't work. Merit pay, rewarding excellence, because it's not the whole profession that's going to, you've got to shift your emphasis to improving working conditions, and this is just a laundry list. Incentives that work are reasonably good salaries, so not the top salaries, but move them up if they're low. Positive climate, good induction, extensive professional development on instruction and assessment, this is learning is the work. Supportive leadership, opportunity to learn, you can see the reasonable class size. Class size is an interesting one. It's kind of a sinkhole, not a high yield strategy, but it's a necessary one to a certain extent. And we've also invested in long-term collective agreements, which are 4-year agreements. We've got we're now just starting our second 4 years, so it means that you don't negotiate salaries during those 4 years. You get it done for 4 years, and then you get it done for another 4 years for the whole province, all the teachers in that. So, systems learning themselves, a couple more points. I love this comment that Pfeffer and Sutton made about Toyota. They said Toyota succeeded over 5 decades, and they've done it without, and this is their phrase, they didn't show any leadership effects. That's a beautiful way of putting it. Toyota is laced with good leadership, but no leadership effects means a leader can leave here and there. They leave, doesn't matter. The whole culture is generating leaders all the time. This is collaborative leadership, if you like. Secondly, there's two things, and I'm going to just close with this about systems learning. This is a quote from Robert Rubin, who was the Secretary Treasurer in Bill Clinton's first term. Some people I've encountered seem more certain about everything than I'm about anything. Here's the dilemma that Secret 6 captures. The future is inherently unpredictable. We can all agree with that in a second. What do you do if you're a leader and you're facing an unpredictable future? You can make 2 errors. One is you can be dead certain, I call it. That's this one, where you're always right. You don't want to work for a leader like that. Or the other leader is you can be excessively humble or overwhelmed and therefore be indecisive. You don't take action. So Secret 6 is in between those 2 extremes. You're not excessively humble and you're not dead certain. The way to think about it is this. I would put a couple of ways of thinking about it. Sometimes leaders have to be more confident than the situation warrants. And I'm going to say if you practice the 6 secrets, you'll have a lot more reason to be more confident because you'll be way more knowledgeable and your people will be more knowledgeable. So you've got a lot more going for you. And then finally, I love this definition of wisdom, Pfeffer and Sutton. Wisdom is using your knowledge while doubting what you know. That means you're assertive about the knowledge that you have and you're going to take action, bias for action, well-informed, purposeful, etc. But you're always going to have that element, I don't know whether we've got it right, but we're on the trail and we're going to correct it, and we're going to admit mistakes and we're going to get better at it, etc. This stuff kind of is a whole cloth. It puts together. You know the book that you can't remember more than 7 things. Well, I've only given you 6, so that's memorable. And once you learn them in combination, they start to reinforce each other in the meaning. So thank you for inviting me, especially at the beginning of your 3-day event, and it was a privilege to lead you off. Thank you.
I'm really happy